Hello! Hello. This took a bit. Whenever I finish reading a book on this channel, I make a video with I call them afterthoughts. Thoughts about the book, the author, what went through my mind while reading the book. And in some cases, I also put in a lot of researched information. And I think this video will be rather one of those videos packed with information. I hope you will find it interesting. Bram Stoker's Dracula. What a book. I can honestly say that this is one of the best books I ever read. And oh boy, there'd be so much to say about it. I could talk for hours and hours and hours, but I won't, no worries. not hours anyway. The problem, though, is what to talk about, right? There are so many aspects that would be really worth diving in deeper. I wrote 4 scripts, and this is why it took so long until this video came out. And I wasn't really sure about either of them because I always felt that there was too much in them, yet not enough. So I finally settled on this 5th one. Still a lot of stuff missing, a lot of incredible stuff missing, but at least I think it's consistent. And again, I hope you will get some information that you find interesting out of this video as well. Let's do this. I want to start a new book next week, right? So, learning about a book, the ideas behind it, the development history, learning about the author, their life, what moved them, that can be very fascinating and very inspirational. And it definitely can give us a deeper insight into the book and open doors, help us see new facets, and in some cases, maybe even get us a completely different perception and perspective. Learning that it took Bram Stoker 7 years to finish Dracula, and that even though, or maybe because, Stoker was a professional writer, that baffled me. And on the other hand, it also calmed me a bit. Stoker worked as a theatre critic for a newspaper. He wrote stories and commentaries and later was the business manager of the Lyceum Theatre, a London West End theatre. And when a man like this needs 7 years to write a novel, it does show that art and creativity are to a large degree perseverance. Sure, talent helps, right? But it's not all. Sticking to something, keeping on doing something, that is in many cases much more important. This thought definitely helped me to at least partially come out of a very deep creative low. If a man like Bram Stoker takes 7 years, who am I to complain that I'm stuck for a couple of weeks with something, right? And I think it's safe to say that these 7 years of work that Stoker put into his magnum opus, Dracula, were definitely worth it. Dracula became arguably one of the most influential characters in the history of modern fiction. Dracula is even in the Guinness Book of Records. And I'm not talking about the book Dracula, but the character Dracula. With 272 screen credits, Dracula is the overall most portrayed literary character in movie history. I found this info in an article from 2012 on the Guinness World Records website. Very likely the number is higher now in 2022 because I presume that between 2012 and 2022 quite some Dracula movies were added to this list. And by the way, this is not 272 movies with vampires. No. This is 272 movies with the actual character Dracula in them. These 272 titles also only include cinema releases, not television or streaming or whatever. Because in a later article from 2015 on the same website, I found that Dracula has been portrayed in a total of 538 films, both cinema releases and television films, which makes him the most portrayed literary character in film and television. In second place, we find Sherlock Holmes with only 299 appearances, but at least this makes him the most portrayed literary human character in film and television. By having created Dracula, I think we can safely say that Bram Stoker became one of the most influential writers, not only in movie history. There are countless novels featuring the character Dracula. There are video games, comic books, action figures, you name it. And yes, indeed, Bram Stoker did actually invent the character Dracula. There was no vampire called Dracula, nor even a Count Dracula before Stoker. In all the hundreds, or more probably even thousands of vampire stories, myths, and legends of all sorts that existed for centuries before Stoker wrote Dracula, no Count Dracula was ever mentioned. And most vampiric entities in the history of literature do not have a lot in common with the Count, other than that blood thing, right? Count Dracula, the vampire, is an original creation and construct of Stoker based on very few sources. The name Dracula is certainly borrowed, and this is a well-established fact, from the historical figure Vlad III, who was also called Vlad Tepes, Vlad the Impaler, or Vlad Dracula, which, according to most sources, actually means Vlad, son of the dragon, simply because Vlad III's father, Vlad II, was called Vlad Dracul, Vlad the Dragon, deriving from Latin Draco, since he was part of the Order of the Dragon, a group of noblemen who allied to defend Europe against the Ottoman Empire. The son of the dragon, Vlad III, became famous, or should I say infamous, for impaling his enemies, hence the name The Impaler. And if you know the 1992 movie Bram Stoker's Dracula by Francis Ford Coppola, there are some quite graphic references to this nickname. And Coppola makes it pretty clear in his movie that the vampire Dracula, in his interpretation of the book, is indeed based on Vlad the Impaler. But was this really what Stoker had in mind? Was Vlad Dracula really the inspiration for the vampire Count Dracula? Actually, no. First of all, the real Dracula was not a count. He was a prince, a voivode, which is more like a military leader. Also, he didn't live in Transylvania, but in Wallachia, which is close to Transylvania, but still a different part of Romania. Secondly, almost nothing about the real Dracula became part of Stoker's version. Sure, the Count was not really a very pleasant person, and the historic Dracula, Vlad III, was also mostly known for his cruelty. And still is known for his cruelty. And here's a little anecdote. I have two Romanian co-workers. Well, actually, I have three Romanian co-workers, but one of them is currently on vacation. So I casually asked them the day before yesterday about Vlad III, and I was amazed by what followed. Basically, the first thing they said was, whatever you have heard about him, or whatever you have read about him, he was worse. And imagine that being said with a thick Romanian accent, which makes it much more impressive. They told me that he was horrible even for the time he lived in, and that was the end of the Middle Ages. And the Middle Ages was a time that wasn't really known for its humanity, was it? According to my co-workers, he was the devil, not the literal devil, but a person with a really fiendish personality, a cruel leader. In the same breath, they also said, without me having asked them about it, by the way, that he wasn't a vampire, like in Bram Stoker, and that nobody would think so, and nobody ever did. And I found it interesting that they mentioned the devil. We're going to talk about that in a moment. Numerous sources mention that the real Dracula was actually liked by his people, even seen as a national hero, very unlike the Dracula in Stoker's novel, who was greatly feared and disliked by the people of Transylvania. So I asked my co-workers about this, and they couldn't really confirm the national hero bit, but said that they know some stories about Vlad III and how his cruelty and how this cruelty caused fear in his people had brought crime rates down. Nobody dared to steal anything because they were mortally afraid of being caught and punished. Yes, sure. This anecdotal evidence does not prove, nor does it disprove anything, any claims about Vlad III being a national hero. I mean, just ask different people about their current government or the government that was replaced by a different government not very long ago. You will most likely hear very different views from different people, actually really ranging from he's the devil to he's the savior. It's telling, though, at least that's how I see it, that even today, more than 500 years after his death, Vlad's cruelty is still talked about, and that his cruelty is immediately brought into the context of something positive, lower crime rates. This is something that I read, that Vlad's cruelty was actually accepted by the people. But back to Dracula, how Bram Stoker found the name and why he chose it for his character. Harry Ludlam, who wrote a Bram Stoker biography in 1962, suggested that Stoker was supplied with information about Vlad Dracula by Armin Vambéry, a professor at the University of Budapest. And this is an interesting thought, because in the novel itself, we find a reference to Armin Vambéry when Van Helsing talks about a friend of his, a certain Arminius of Budapest University, who seemed to be familiar with the historical Vlad III. But neither in Vambéry's published papers nor in Stoker's notes about his meeting with Vambéry can we find anything about Vlad, Dracula, or even vampires. Sir Christopher Frayling, a British educationalist, researcher, and writer, mentioned in a lecture on Bram Stoker, or actually on Bram Stoker's nightmares, that Stoker stumbled over the name Dracula in a footnote of a document titled an account of the principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia, and according to Frayling, Stoker liked the name Dracula because he thought it means devil. And this is something that Professor David Davis, an English scholar and expert on the subject Dracula, also confirmed in one of his lectures. Both of these lectures, by the way, are actually on YouTube, and I linked them in the description. I found them incredibly fascinating and also very entertaining. I really watch them. I can only suggest to watch them. These are really great and very entertaining and very insightful lectures. Professor Davis also mentioned that Stoker used the name Dracula for the title of his novel, after his publisher told him that the working titles, the original working titles of the novel, Count Vampire, or later The Undead, won't work. They won't sell. And so he changed the title to Dracula. Of course, I was curious, and I asked my co-workers about the devil, and they said that indeed devil in Romanian means drac or dracu, not Dracula, though. But since Vlad Dracula was actually seen as the devil or a devilish person, it is kind of true that Vlad Dracula was a devil, so Stoker wasn't wrong. The name Dracula, though, seems to be really the only thing that the historical Dracula and the Dracula in Stoker's novel have in common. Which other sources were there that Stoker used? Professor Davis lists 4 other sources that Stoker obviously used for creating Dracula, and all these 4 sources were quite contemporary sources of this time, which is interesting given that there are literally thousands of years of vampire mythology. It seems, though, that the English literary tradition during this time was very, very thin. The 4 sources David lists are the poem Tabala the Destroyer by Robert Southey, the short story The Vampire or Vampyr. I don't really know how to pronounce it correctly. It's spelled Vampyr, so I guess Vampyr, by John William Polidori, which is considered to be the first published modern vampire story, and also seems to be the first story in which the vampire is an aristocrat. Then there are the Penny Dreadfuls Varney the Vampire, and last but not least, the novella Carmilla by Sheridan Le Fanu. Stoker put many bits and pieces from these texts into his novel, like Dracula being an aristocrat, that he has hypnotic powers and superhuman strength, and that he's draining his victims over days. And by doing so, he created his very own version of the vampire, which eventually, basically, became the blueprint of how we see vampires today. Because even though when we read about a vampire, when we see vampires in movies and they're not Dracula, they have quite some similarities to this specific character, which is very unlike many of the mythical vampires that we can find in texts and other sources that describe vampirism. A very common, but not the only idea, is that Stoker based Dracula's appearance and also the character of his vampire on the actor Henry Irving, whom he adored. And adored might even be an understatement. To Stoker, Irving was a god, according to one biographer. While on the other hand, Irving was a self-absorbed and highly manipulative person who inspired fear and animosity in Stoker. It was kind of a love-hate relationship that Stoker had with Irving. Funnily enough, and interestingly enough, Polidori modeled the vampire of his short story, which Stoker used as one of his sources, after Lord Byron, whom Polidori also had sort of a love-hate relationship with. It's quite an interesting parallel, I'd say. Another fact, also interesting, not really has anything to do with Dracula though, but interesting. Polidori's short story originated in the same writing competition that Lord Byron started, and that also brought forth another incredibly famous novel and another incredibly influential literary character, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. One of the aspects that made Dracula so fascinating for me is the genius way it was written. Stoker used a version of the epistolary novel, a novel in which the story is told through letters. Stoker, of course, also used diary and journal entries and cutouts of newspaper articles. As a journalist, Stoker was used to this way of writing, right? Assembling information and constructing a story out of that. And I really think that this shows that Stoker's knowledge of this way of writing shows, and experience of this kind of writing shows. And despite being basically an accumulation of fragments, granted, fragments Stoker created himself and shaped to use them, nothing feels forced. It flows. As a reader, I had the impression that it simply felt so much more natural reading the accounts of different people than if the story would have been told by an omniscient narrator. It's a genius way for a book like this, and it adds also some feel of reality to it, specifically with the newspaper cuttings. Mary Shelley used a sort of similar technique in Frankenstein by using different narrators, though her technique was, at least that's how I see it, and I almost feel bad about saying it, not as sophisticated as Stoker's. And I said I almost feel bad about it. We mustn't forget that Mary Shelley was still a teenager when she wrote the book, right? And not an experienced and established journalist as Stoker was. Through the different narrators, Shelley also gave us different perspectives. What she did, though, was to tell different elements of the story through different people, while Stoker, in many parts, gave us different views on the same element of the story, and so a much more complete image. And I find this pretty genius. Looking at my watch, I think that I slowly have to come to the end, I guess. But there are two things that I need to mention. I thought a very long time whether I want to talk about the speculations and discussions about Bram Stoker's personal life and his sexuality, whether he was secretly gay, and whether the clear sexual references in his novel were his way of dealing with his repressed sexuality. But quite honestly, I think this is too big and too important a topic to just briefly touch on it in part of a video like this. It's also too big and too important a topic to not even mention it. So what to do? I decided to actually just really keep it that way. There are discussions about, and from what I read, quite convincing arguments that Stoker almost certainly has been secretly gay and indeed worked the struggles with his repressed sexuality into the novel. His quite bizarre relationship to Oscar Wilde, his extreme adoration for Irving and also Walt Whitman, who was known to be at least bisexual, if not homosexual, whom he idolized. the clearly homoerotic references in the novel, specifically when we compare them with the notes he made during the writing process, to unravel all that, that would take time. And I don't think I could do this in a respectful manner in just a short, brief part of a video like this. If you're interested in this aspect, and I'd encourage you to do that because it's really fascinating, simply check out the Wikipedia articles on Stoker and the novel Dracula and use the references there for finding starting points for doing your own research. Last but not least, and I need to at least mention this, right? The movies. I found an incredibly fascinating video on YouTube with a comparison of many Dracula movies and how close they are to the novel. If you're a geek like me, check this video out. You will not be disappointed. And I think you will also be quite surprised. The link, of course, is in the description. Alrighty, this one's for today. Bye-bye till next time. Sunday, the Sunday poem. On Monday, I'll start a new novel, a novel that was suggested by even a couple of you wonderful people out there. No spoilers yet. I think you will like it, though. I will soon resume with my Saturday short story readings here and there. And with all that having said, have a great one. See you, read you, maybe even hear you. Who knows?